Welcome gardeners! Today we're going to be introducing ourselves to the garden at Sunset Community Garden, located in Sunset Park in so-called South Vancouver. The goal of our garden is to rehabilitate that space and bring back some of the natural life to the area. A year ago, we didn't have much of a garden at all, and I would see the occasional crow. I'm so grateful to have had those early believers in our garden. As soon as we put in some more pollinator-friendly plants, some beautiful rose bushes and California lilac and so many others, that very same day those plants went in, I saw a hummingbird visit our garden. That was such an incredible thing to see because it was instant. That hummingbird is in the area looking for food, and prior to that day, our garden didn't have anything for it. We just had a couple of raised boxes with some vegetables growing, but there wasn't anything for pollinators at large to feed on. Now there's so much more life in that garden, from insects to birds to squirrels to even to funguses. We really need to acknowledge how privileged we are to be the assigned caretakers of that piece of land. We're on unceded Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish lands, and yet we're the ones who are stewards of this area. So we need to make sure that we are doing justice to this land and putting in our native plants, bringing back the native insects and wildlife to the area. So what is at Sunset? At the beginning of the year, we had 3 raised boxes, which were generously donated in 2019 by Parks Board, as well as a garden shed that, along with help from the Sunset Community Center, we were able to get built. Throughout 2020, we put in over 100 feet of new garden beds, which is really incredible. So well done to everybody who was involved in that. It was a lot of work, but it really paid off. We put a bunch of native plants that were generously donated by David Suzuki Foundation's Butterfly Way project, as well as the City of Vancouver. So there's hardhack or spirea, as well as ocean spray. We've got Douglas asters, goldenrod, kinnikinick, salal berries, wild strawberries, red osier dogwood, salmonberry, elderberry, oh man, so many, huckleberry, Scowers willow. We've got a blueberry plant in, and hopefully more will be added in the coming year, as well as tons and tons of vegetables. Thanks to donations from members of the community, we put in several hundred kale plants, which actually allowed us to donate over 35 kilos of produce to South Van neighborhood houses, Better at Home meal delivery program for seniors and people with disabilities. That was really incredible, and I'm so glad we had the opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of the produce that was meant to go to that program was taken without authorization from the garden. So unfortunately, we weren't able to harvest a single squash or a single cabbage to donate to the program, even though we had several dozen that we should have been able to donate. So obviously, one big problem with community gardens is it's really hard to stop non-members from taking our produce. I'd love to hear some feedback about what we could do about that, how we could discourage it, or how we could just counter it a little bit. We tried planting surplus this year, as well as putting up signs stating that the produce goes towards programs. However, those were both ineffective strategies. So as well as the David Suzuki Foundation's Butterfly Way project, we have another pollinator focused project within the garden, which is the pollinator path. They are focused on creating a corridor of plants within our South Vancouver neighborhood to allow pollinators to commute throughout the city. So at the moment, there's a beautiful space at Memorial South Park. They have a very big garden space there purely for pollinator plants, and they're trying to create boulevard gardens and green spaces between there and Sunset Park that will allow pollinators to travel from one area of the city to another. So the mix of plants that we have in our garden is really important. We not only have nectar plants, which most people know feed pollinators, but we also have host plants. These are the places that pollinators will lay their eggs and that will feed the freshly hatched insects in the spring. So these kinds of habitats are so essential for us to leave behind for pollinators, but it's also important that we leave some of the seed heads and some of the berries for birds and other insects. We want to be attracting that life to the garden instead of just utilizing the space for humans. So as I mentioned, before we put our garden in, there was virtually no life within that park. This is because it was purely grass with a few dandelions here and there, which are excellent pollinators, but it's not enough to bring life back into the area. And truly, just with adding those raised boxes, I saw so much increased presence of insects. And then when we added our over 100 feet of new beds, it was really incredible to see the transformation in that garden. Lori used the word oasis to describe Mac, and it's truly the same at Sunset. Even though our garden is still small and really has a lot of room to grow, it's already becoming a place where life just gathers. So the gardening practices at Mac have really impacted what we're doing at Sunset. One way is through permaculture. So we noticed that our site is in a little bit of a basin. So on the slope downhill, we planted our larger bushes that catch a lot of water. Those are also along the western edge of our garden because that's generally the direction that the wind comes. So to create a wind block and protect our more fragile or delicate plants, we put in the hardhack and ocean spray. The willow is planted at the wettest part of our garden. It gets so muddy and soggy in there, so the willow and the blueberry are loving it. It's the perfect place for them to grow. One thing we have to keep in mind when we're planting in our beds is how will those plants grow? And once they grow, how will that affect the sun and how will those capture the water? So we really have to be aware of what our garden will look like in the future, which is hard when plants are small, but that's why it's really important to get acquainted with what you're putting into our garden before we put it in. As I mentioned, we want to leave some berries and seeds for birds and animals. This is what we call an honorable harvest. We're not only leaving for birds and animals, but we're leaving for other garden members or members of the community. So we want to make sure that we're only taking about 10% of what there is ready to take in our garden to make sure that there's enough for everyone. We had a lot of problems with dishonorable harvest this year, as I mentioned. Not only were the squash and cabbages harvested without authorization, they were taken super prematurely, so they weren't anywhere close to ready. This also happened with the tomatoes. They were taken off the vine while they were still green. While it's true that tomatoes can ripen off the vine, it's best to leave them on until rainy season starts and then take them off. The tomatoes were taken off way too early this year, and instead of ripening, they just kind of rotted. So it's really a shame to see this kind of mistreatment of the crops in the garden, because frankly they deserve better. They bring life to us and to the area, and we should be harvesting properly. I know that our garden doesn't look typical to a lot of people, especially in the fall and winter. We don't keep it neat and tidy and cut off all the branches once the leaves fall off. Again, we want to leave habitat for insects to lay their eggs and to overwinter. We don't want to be getting rid of dead plants in our garden. We want to be putting those plants back into the soil, letting them decompose, letting them become compost and fertilizer and habitat for our garden. It's time that we move away from the Eurocentric horticulture that we see in our parks and even in our private homes. We need to move back towards the messy gardens, leaving things for creatures other than humans. You know, people might think it's not as aesthetically pleasing, but it's just a different aesthetic that we have to get used to and learn to accept and to see the benefit of. Because really, you know, the classic Eurocentric horticulture, it might be tidy, but it's lifeless. They plant flowers that don't encourage pollinators. You know, the doubles might be beautiful and hybrid flowers are gorgeous, but so are native flowers. So is native plants. So is native life. And so we need to shift our perception. You know, I struggled a lot this year because I felt that the garden didn't get the respect it deserves. And I see this as my privileged place in society that I have the energy to be upset about it. But, you know, Parks Board excessively mows the lawn, and more than once it damaged our plants. Our red osier was broken, many of our berries were mowed right to the ground. And while I think it's important that we fight against that kind of mindset where everything has to be tidy and everything has to be mowed, we also need to see sometimes there's incredible things that come from that. So our red osier dogwood that was severely damaged this year, it was so healthy and it was beautiful. The blooms on her were gorgeous. And after she was damaged, all of a sudden she got swarmed by aphids. The whole plant was covered in aphids. And that was really upsetting at first until I looked closer and saw how many predatory bugs had been brought because of those aphids. The red osier was covered in aphids, but it was also covered in wasps and ladybugs. They were swarming all over the red osier. So, you know, I would have preferred to have the red osier dogwood stay healthy and not get damaged in the first place. However, there's not much we can do about it. So I think it's important that we recognize the good things that come with it too, like all those insects that were suddenly in our garden. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about sunset, and it's really exciting to think what our update video will be next year and to see how much growth there is within that space in 2021. So until the next video, keep getting your hands dirty.